Welcome back to the Management Lab podcast. I'm Uri Gal from the University of Sydney Business School.
And I'm Sean Hansen from Saunders College of Business at Rochester Institute of Technology.
I got to say, Sean, hello, by the way.
Oh, hello.
Now
I want to hear what you have to say.
There was such a stark difference in our levels of energy just to, kick things off. I'm bringing my A game and you're sounding like you're about to fall asleep.
Oh, no, I'm going for sultry.
Okay.
One of my first jobs out of college was at a credit card company. It was MBNA America, which is now part of Bank of America. And, had to do, take customer calls, and I hated taking customer calls and that sort of thing. But one of the managers there used to tease me and say that every time I answered the phone, it sounded like I was trying to put on some sort of a sexy voice. And I'm like, I'm answering complaining credit card customer calls. Believe me, I'm not going for sexy voice.
Okay. Well, I'm somewhat relieved, I guess.
Yes, you should be.
How are things? Everything okay?
Yeah, hanging in there, plugging away. It's been a very busy semester here in Rochester. We have launched a PhD program, and that's been I've been teaching a couple courses there, and it's been quite exciting.
Cool. We are having a public holiday today. There's a public holiday here in Victoria. The state where Melbourne is, and the reason is, do you know what the reason is for the public holiday today?
I do not. Is it just in Victoria?
I believe so.
Or is it a national? Yeah, interesting.
I believe it's just in Victoria.
Ned Kelly Day. I don't know. I'm guessing.
No, that is not the reason. No, the reason is that we have the grand final this evening. I believe it's this evening. I want to say it is in AFL, Australian Football League.
Oh yeah, Aussie rules, Aussie football.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
It's a very big deal here. Obviously, given it's a public holiday, everybody is off today, so they can party and watch the game.
That's very cool. I'll have to look it up online.
I don't know
if you know, but
you don't have in the U.S. public holidays during the finals of anything, right? That's not something you would do.
No, they've talked about making the day after the Super Bowl a public holiday because people get so liquored up. People get so liquored up on this during the Super Bowl. Oh, we have to call it the big game because you're not allowed to use the formal name of it. There's all kinds of copyright. But anyway,
right?
People have talked about, yeah, seriously. It's actually ridiculous. So in the ads leading up to the NFL championship game, I'll call it the NFL championship game, all the ads will consistently call it the big game. They won't call it the Super Bowl.
And so who owns the copyright?
Because of
the NFL?
The NFL. Yeah. I don't know if I'm sure you don't pay attention to the NFL at all, but I'm quite excited about my Cleveland Browns. The defense is stout. They're the defense, at least. The offense we'll see, but the defense is so good. It's the best defense I've seen in so long.
So how far into the season are you right now?
Only 3 games. 3 games so far, and they've already had some tragedy. The star tailback, Nick Chubb, who's one of the 2 or 3 best tailbacks in the NFL, blew out his knee last week.
Oh, okay.
So that was pretty heartbreaking.
Well, when you said tragedy, I was,
Oh yeah, no one died, but
different places have different meanings for the word.
Yeah,
I guess being
torn MCL,
being a privileged American, that's your version of tragedies.
Well, I mean, it's in the scope of sports. It's pretty tragic.
Yeah.
Because he's out for it's a season-ending injury. Apparently, it's not a career-ending injury. And the guy is just you've got to love him. He works his butt off. They have these videos of him like lifting weights, and it's astounding. Like
How big is this guy? How much does he
he's
weigh roughly?
um oh, I would guess maybe 210. I mean, he's not a huge guy, but he's strong as an ox, and he just works really hard. And he's not a guy who seeks a ton of limelight. He just runs the ball. And so I think it was certainly for anyone who's a fan of the Cleveland Browns, it was a pretty tragic moment.
My strongest memory of the NFL is not a one-time memory necessarily, but it's just the huge disparity between the length of a broadcast of a game, which would be what, 2-3 hours, something like that. Is that right?
Three plus generally, yeah.
Yeah, and the amount of actual game time, which is like
Well, the
15
amount of
minutes.
actual game time is exactly 60 minutes,
No,
barring
actual
overtime.
play, like people doing stuff on the field.
Oh, well, yeah. So that actual play would be much less, but the game clock is a total of 60 minutes. Yes.
Right. But anyway,
Yeah, I understand, and I dislike that also. I hate sitting through the commercials, so I love when I can bank some cushion on the DVR, and I can fast forward through commercials and things like that. But what can I say? I love American football. I love it. I could watch college football for hours.
yeah, I think it's one of those things that it really helps if you were born into and grew up with, right? That you have a
Oh, for
certain
sure.
affinity that kind of, and baseball is even a stronger case of this, I think, because as much as I've tried, and I spent 5 years in the U.S., I couldn't really get into it. It's just such an
Yeah, I love
idiosyncratic
baseball
sport.
too, but yeah, you're right. I love baseball too, but baseball has definitely faded in popularity in recent years. I will say one of the observations I make about all sports, and I think this is true, is your enjoyment of the game goes up right in line with your knowledge of the game.
Mm.
And so, like, there's things that I see in a football game, having watched and played football and things like that, that, I'll watch it with other people who maybe didn't have the same, weren't as steeped in it. And they just don't see the same things. They really don't see the same things. And I think in any sport, that same principle applies, that the more you understand the sport, the strategies, things like that, your appreciation just
For
goes up
sure.
exponentially.
I think it's true beyond
Yeah,
sports as well. I think I have a friend who once told me that he's an academic and he was doing work in something that I thought was very obscure and kind of semi-boring. And he told me something that surprised me. He said, "Well, I found it boring as well, but then I started reading into it, and the more you know about this, the more you find the topic interesting." So I think it goes beyond
sure.
sports. I actually thought you were going to say something else.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say sports become more interesting the more engaged you are in it, and the more attached you feel to a certain team. Like if you're actually supporting somebody, the whole thing becomes more exciting.
Oh, that's certainly true. Yeah, no doubt. I
Which
think
kind
that's
of
one of the reasons why gambling
yeah.
gambling increases people's engagement in sports, because once they have money on the line, they have a rooting interest.
Yeah, yeah, which kind of leads to in kind of a roundabout way to the topic of the conversation today, which is emotions,
Yeah.
right, and feelings, and specifically, we're going to talk about how emotions are tied into artificial intelligence systems, right? So we want to talk
Yeah.
about the
We,
various
it
cases.
brings us back just a little. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Restart that last sentence.
It brings us back to the conversations we've had before about AI in different contexts. We talked about productivity and AI and about ethics. Um, and these conversations are obviously not divorced from one another, but today we're going to kind of peel off another layer in this smelly onion and talk about the various interfaces between emotions and artificial intelligence.
What a compelling metaphor for any of our listeners. Come join us as we peel off another layer of a smelly onion.
So where do
But
we
yes, it's
where do we where do we want to start the conversation?
So I think it might be worthwhile to discuss just briefly what we mean when we say emotions in the context of artificial intelligence, because there's a couple different angles that we're seeing that you see in the research literature. One of them is what is called emotional AI, which is artificial intelligence that is specifically oriented around recognizing and responding to human emotion.
Mm-hmm.
The other is the role of emotions in people's acceptance of, use of, openness to artificial intelligence writ large.
Mm-hmm. And I guess a third angle that we'll talk about is the degree to which, and I guess the ease with which people develop emotional bonds with AI systems, which we'll
Yeah,
talk about later as well. But the first strand that you mentioned, EAI, emotional artificial intelligence, has to do with the development of AI systems that allegedly or supposedly can read and respond to human emotions, or expressions of human emotions. And that element of AI, that strand of research and commercial applications of AI, I guess, can be traced back roughly to the mid 1990s, right? And the origination of the concept of affective computing, affective with an A,
yeah, affective.
affective, and that came out of
Yeah,
MIT, right? A certain professor by the name of Rosalind Picard, right? She coined the phrase affective computing.
yeah. Wrote a book called Affective Computing. I'm seeing. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and the proposition there was that computers should be able to be programmed in such a way so that they can identify and respond to human emotional expressions. So that's where this kind of started in the mid 1990s. But over the years, we've seen with, I guess, the evolution of thinking about this and advancements in technology, various commercial applications of different types of EAI systems that are being used across different domains. So I guess many people have heard about different forms of sentiment analyses that are performed through social media platforms. But we've seen applications in other domains as well.
Well, and I think there's a couple different aspects there. The sentiment analysis certainly has had widespread adoption over the last 10 years, and I've heard people say that we're even moving beyond that. But that's sort of looking at textual communication and discerning emotionally loaded commentary to discern, how are people feeling based on the comments that they make. But I think the whole world of computer vision has brought a new layer here, because computer vision can recognize emotion in people's facial expressions, body language, tone. I guess that's not computer vision, but all of these related tools can recognize emotion in people's tone of speech and things like that. And I think that really takes the entire recognition of emotion to a very different level.
Yeah, so there are different types of data that would be gauged in order to interpret or identify human emotions. So yeah, facial expressions is certainly one of them, body language, text, and even different biophysical markers like your blood pressure and stuff like that could be used to infer your state of mind or your emotional state rather. And
Yep.
one domain in particular that is interesting to us as business professors is the use of systems like this in the workplace. And this is a trend that has become more increasingly significant in the last few years, where we see different types of systems being used to assess and identify and even monitor workers' emotional states. And oftentimes when you look at those systems and even the marketing materials behind them, they're oftentimes rationalized and explained in terms of being this technology that can help managers make sure that employees are engaged and satisfied and happy and maintain across the organization, across the business, high levels of well-being, and also to detect when people exhibit various expressions of being stressed out or burned out or having different types of
Hmm.
emotional difficulties. So that's the way these systems are often portrayed as tools that can help managers maintain the well-being of their employees.
Yeah, corporate wellness programs and things like
Exactly.
that. Like if helping to identify when interventions might be needed, or workload management, or workload distribution and things like that might have to be implemented to improve employee wellness.
Yeah.
Now, before we get into any of the research we talked about, when you said at the beginning, you said uh, purported benefits, and I thought I caught a tone of skepticism. Is your general outlook skeptical with regard to this EAI technology in terms of whether or not it can recognize accurately expressions of human emotion?
So there's a, I guess the science behind it is split. I think there are some scientific studies that can be used to support this line of using EAI systems in the workplace to identify and respond to human emotions in an effective way, effective with an E here. But there's other
Mm-hmm.
strands of research that I guess promote a more skeptical approach to the way this is currently being done. And in fact, one of the papers that we read talks exactly to that point. This is a paper by Stark and Hoey, The Ethics of Emotion in
Mm-hmm.
Artificial Intelligence Systems. And the basic argument that they have in the paper is that one could rely on different modalities of emotions in order to design and develop systems that could effectively read and respond to these emotions. And the argument that they make is that the vast majority of EAI systems currently in the market today rely on this one, roughly speaking, classical view of emotions. And
This is what they refer to as basic emotion theory.
that's I think that's the main theory within that camp. Yes.
Yeah.
So I believe they refer to this as motivational theories, but basic emotion theories I think is probably one of the most, if not the most, dominant theory in that camp. And roughly speaking, what it says is that we have these hardwired modules in our brain um, that produce emotional responses to different stimuli in the environment. Right. So you see a snake, and the relevant module in your brain produces a fearful response. And we would have a circuit for fear and another circuit for happiness and another one for sadness and so on and so forth. And the reason we have these modules or this circuitry in our brain is typically explained evolutionarily from an evolutionary perspective, right? We're hardwired
Right.
to be afraid of snakes because that's we're hardwired for self-preservation. So that's basically the reason why our brains are structured in this way. But the way this portrays emotions is as a reactive kind of biological instinct that we have. And importantly, and specifically the basic emotion theory conceptualizes emotions as this universal thing that we all have, and we all basically process and express it in a very similar way. So it's completely culture and time independent.
Right. It assumes a universality across all human beings.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's one of the main points of critique about the way these systems, EAI systems, operate, is that they're not sensitive to cultural and contextual differences in the way people express emotions.
Yeah, and potentially even experience emotions, right? Like I think there are cultural differences that have been documented in terms of sort of emotional perception in the face of certain stimuli, let's say.
Yeah, and there's a whole strand of literature that kind of portrays an alternative way of understanding emotions, which is much more interactive and dynamic and context specific. Right, so it's not just a
Yeah.
passive reactive response to a stimuli in the environment. It's actually something that we construct actively to engage with our environment in a more active manner. And so, given any type of cues from the environment, we would react to these cues or interact with these cues rather in a more proactive way, trying to predict what's
Right.
going to happen next and generate an emotional response that would kind of allow us to respond in an appropriate way.
Yeah. The one of the there's a couple things that occurred to me in this review. One, I certainly agree with the point that emotional expression can be culturally specific. And actually, one of the things that jumped to mind for me right away is here at RIT. One of our colleges at RIT is NTID, which is the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, and so we have a large number of American Sign Language. I don't want to use the word speakers because they're not speaking, signers, right? Like people whose primary language is American Sign Language, and the grammar of American Sign Language is very much facial. It is largely reflected in your facial expressions, such that I feel like these tools would grossly, my assumption, unless it was trained specifically for an ASL community, the deaf community, would totally misinterpret so much of the facial expressions, or so many of the facial expressions rendered by people when they're communicating in ASL. And one simple example of this is in ASL, a furrowed brow. For for listeners, imagine I'm furrowing my brow right now for Uri, but a furrowed brow, which could mean, I think most English speakers could mean frustration or extreme quizzicalness, is just a grammatical way of signaling a question of any sort in ASL. So if I make a hand motion for where, a sign for where, and I do this, I'm asking the question of the other, and I think that would be completely misinterpreted by tools like this.
Yeah. I think there's also obvious cultural differences in the way that we express emotions vocally with our voice. And I'm always reminded of multiple examples. I was born and raised in Israel. And when you have Americans who come to Israel for the first time, and I guess it's true for people from other parts of the world, they keep asking, why is everybody shouting? Why is everybody angry all the time? And I have to explain to them, they're not angry. That's just the way they converse.
Oh my God. Well, then I came from a household of Irish Catholics that seemingly must have Jewish lineage somewhere along the line, or at least Israeli connection somewhere along the line, because we are the loudest, most verbally aggressive people, particularly like at family gatherings. Mm-hmm. Oh my God, my wife used to get so annoyed with how loud my brothers and I would communicate with one another. And I'm the quiet one. That's actually all you need to know, Uri. Since you know me, my oldest brother, who is the loudest human being on the face of the earth, and if he ever listens to this, I hope he does, because he needs to concede it. But he thinks it's hilarious that I say I'm the quiet one. I'm objectively the quiet one amongst I have two brothers. I come from a family of three boys, three males. I can't say boys when we're all over 50, but and it's very obvious that I'm the quiet one in the family, and yet no one wants to concede that point.
Yeah. Well, anyway, circling back to the conversation that other people might find interesting as well. So yes, there are. I think you were right to detect skepticism in my voice before, not because I'm necessarily or fundamentally skeptical about this, but just because the science is kind of split about the way these current systems are designed, which is based on this universal understanding of emotional expressions. And
right.
Interestingly, we looked at another study by Corvett et al. From 2020, just a very recent study, in fact, that looked at people's attitudes about these sort of technologies, and they found some interesting stuff actually about some of the main concerns and hopes that people have in relation to the use of these technologies in the workplace. Did you want me to go quickly through the findings, or did you have any, maybe before I did it, did you have any initial reactions about that paper?
Well, before the findings, I think one of the things that was really interesting about this particular study is that they present to their respondents. So this is a survey-based study, and they surveyed. They drew a survey of 500. I think it was roughly 500, a sample of roughly 500 that reflects the population of the United States, and then they deliberately oversampled on top of that for members of marginalized groups. So racial or ethnic minorities, gender minorities, which is not women in this case, even though since women are actually a majority on the face of the earth, but it's people with alternative gender identification outside of the traditional binary. And then also people with prior experience with mental health. So they deliberately oversample for people in those categories, and essentially ask them. They present them with vignettes of multiple different workplace applications or societal applications, you might say, of these EAI tools, and ask them their perspective in each of those contexts.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think they oversampled of the marginalized populations?
So this is actually one of the slight issues I had with this paper. So the paper specifically presents themselves as approaching the analysis of these tools from a relational ethics lens, but they never then say what relational ethics are. They never explain relational ethics in the abstract. Relational ethics, for listeners, is a particular school of or a body of ethical theory that comes out of feminist ethics, and it basically argues that much of traditional ethics, things that you and I have written about, for example, come from a Western and male context, so that they're very much focused on individual. Virtue ethics is about how do you live the right life as an individual, a good life as an individual. How should each of us individually act in a given context? And so the key insight from relational ethics or argument from relational ethics is that ethics are fundamentally tied to relations, human relationships, and so that they can't, or again, from this perspective, shouldn't be analyzed in the abstract. They have to be analyzed in context, in the context of relationships and how one is caring and supportive of others. So I think that is why they deliberately oversampled for marginalized groups. But there's nothing in this analysis that suggests to me that, other than that sampling, that it's a relational. Like I feel like there's a rhetorical gap there, where they say it's a relational ethics lens, but basically relational ethics only is operative insofar as we're asking people in marginalized, or placing an emphasis on people in marginalized communities, their perceptions of this particular phenomenon.
Okay. Let's look at some of the findings that they had.
Yeah.
So let me point out a few pointers that stood out to me. And if you have any reactions, I'm going to go through them. If you have any reactions, just let me know what they are. Should we do that?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So about 32% of the participants didn't deem EAI, emotional artificial intelligence systems, to be beneficial to them at all. So about a third of the respondents just didn't see any benefit in using EAI in the workplace. Roughly more than half of the respondents had concerns surrounding privacy issues, and about how the use of EAI by employers can contribute to their worsened well-being.
Yeah, well, and I think part of that is, it goes along with privacy, but also part of that is fear of perpetuation of bias, right? And this is something that I think we've talked about in some of our previous conversations.
But that's a different point. I was going to get to that.
Okay, all right, go ahead. Sorry,
but I do want to say something about privacy, which I think is really important, and somehow many people just kind of, I don't know, lose sight of it or don't pay much attention to it in the context of EAI. But to me, there's a certain there always is, I guess, a certain unwritten contract between employers and employees, which is, I give you some of my time and talent and effort, and in return, I'm going to get some financial compensation from you. I guess the question is, where do we draw the line in terms of what it is that I am as an employee contributes to the business, to the employer. And it seems like over time, it's kind of the line keeps moving, right? And it seems like
Hmm.
employers
Hmm.
want more and more out of their employees, because I think there's an argument to be made that my emotions, my feelings, and forgive my language, are none of none of your fucking business. It's my private, individual, personal state. It's
Yeah.
got nothing to do
Yeah.
with you. Why would you be, as an organization that I'm working for, what business do you have meddling with my emotions and feelings?
Or analyzing, yeah, analyzing my emotions and feelings. Even, yeah, I certainly I find that argument aligns with my own perspective, right? Like if you can't keep if the machine if the tools can analyze all aspects of my emotion because I can't control some of my facial expressions, like it definitely has that feeling of going beyond um, a threshold.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a pushing of the boundary there that's not discussed often enough in the context of these technologies. But I think it's very significant.
Yeah. Well, I think it also contributes outside of or in relation to privacy, but maybe a little ancillary. This idea of people feeling like they're under a microscope,
Mm.
right? So that it's this, even if these tools are being purported as something that will support their work and their well-being, but people come away feeling that I'm always being analyzed.
Mhm.
All of my, my body, my posture, my gestures, my tone of voice, everything is perpetually being analyzed.
Yeah.
And I think that that feeling of like deep seated surveillance, I think is one of the real drivers of concern here.
Yeah, and I think it's even more than that. I think it used to be the case that only our output was surveilled or monitored consistently by our employers, right? That was the most important thing. But then with the advent of various technologies, surveillance tools have become more sophisticated and have actually enabled employers to monitor the throughput and the input, not just the output of our work, like what we actually do day in, day out. And we've talked about, I'm sure we've talked about scientific management on the podcast before, and we've talked
We
about
have,
people analytics, which is the application of AI to manage people in organizations. But these technologies and these trends really do emphasize, productive work, things that we do with our that are visible to the outside observer, through different activities that we're engaged in. So I think we just taken this a step further with in terms of the surveillance mechanism here, that we go beyond just observing what we do and the activities that we engage in and our behaviors, but this is actually trying to interpret our internal emotional states. So I just think that the gaze is trying to get even deeper into who we are as individuals.
I do. I'm a little skeptical at the complete novelty here. Meaning, I don't know that through most of contemporary business history that managers were just managing the output, right? I think there's plenty of basis for saying that managers have always attended to certain emotional issues. The classic, so and so has a bad attitude. Bad attitude is basically a way of saying I don't like your emotional presence within the workplace, and that people might be sort of given demerits or being critiqued based on the attitude that they seem to bring to the workplace. Having said that, I do concede the point that this takes that type of surveillance and observation to a different level, and one that is troubling
Yeah. Okay. So
or has
that
troubling potential.
yeah. So that kind of covers the point around privacy, which we said roughly half of the respondents were concerned about. The second point of concern, that about a third of the respondents had, was to do with inaccurate and incorrect inferences about them that could be made based on these technologies, which I think goes back to
Right.
the point that we made before, right, about cultural differences and different types of population that might express the same emotions using very different facial expressions or vocal tones or what have you. And because
Right. Yeah.
these systems are not currently designed to be able to detect different cultural differences and in terms of how emotions are expressed, there's a very real likelihood that they will misinterpret and misread emotional cues as given by individuals, which obviously could have very significant consequences.
Yeah. And even with the advanced computer vision, I think that's a very real concern. There was some application a couple of years ago for I guess it was on one of like the iPhone or something like that, and it was supposed to take a picture. The cameras within the iPhone was supposed to take a picture right at the perfect moment when everyone's eyes were open. But because do you know this story?
I no, but I think I know where it's going.
So it was supposed to be like, don't do it when people are blinking, take it when everyone's eyes are open, and it was using AI to recognize that and take the picture without the person having to click the button. But because it was trained on mostly European faces, it was failing to recognize in particular Asian peoples when their eyes were open because of the difference in eye shape traditionally between European and Asian eyes. It was basically acting like Asian people always had their eyes closed because it was trained on a different data set.
Yeah.
And I think that same principle certainly could apply here with regard to expressions of emotion and tone and all of those aspects.
Yeah, which and I think this example is also demonstrative of the bias risk that we mentioned before, right? Because when you have systems that are insensitive to cultural differences, it's very likely that some populations might be discriminated against or mistreated based on the use of these technologies. So
Yep.
we've talked about some of the main points of concern that people had in the survey. Some of the positive points that they raised was the potential for these systems to provide the necessary information to employers to identify health conditions that they might suffer from and provide support to them early on in the process. So I guess that's going to be the ideal type, the ideal scenario based on which these technologies can be. That's kind of the marketing material, right? That's what they're supposed to do. Should we go through a couple of more positive points that people identified?
Sure.
Just very quickly. So there was the one that we just mentioned was the potential to identify health conditions and provide support to people based on this identification. That was mentioned by about 30% of the respondents. 16% of them noted the potential for EAI, emotional artificial intelligence, to benefit them by diagnosing a mental health condition early through health monitoring and detection, and also to alert employers when employees might be experiencing work overload. So all these really have to do with the capacity of these systems, allegedly, to identify people's emotional states and to alert employers when these states cross a certain threshold.
Yeah, well, in a counterpoint to what we saw in the bias, one of the other benefits that we see here is this idea of the potential for reducing stigma, different types of stigma. For example, stigma around mental health, so that ideally this would feed into efforts at wellness and not things that would ostracize or isolate people who maybe are experiencing an acute mental health episode.
Yeah. I gotta say though, when you weigh out the potential benefits and the potential risks, I still feel uncomfortable about the use of tools like this in the workplace. And perhaps the main reason, one of the big reasons, is that employees usually don't get asked, do you want to use the system or not? Do you want to be part of this regime or not? It's just, it's presented to them as a matter of fact that this is now happening. This is what we do. This is what we use in this organization. And like it or not, you're part of this now. And like
Yeah.
we said before, I think this is a very problematic proposition.
Yeah, I think the key insight from the study is the same: is that the perception of risks is greater than the perception of benefits,
Yeah.
or opportunities.
Yeah. So one of the other papers we looked at took a different perspective on the interface between emotions and AI, and what they did is they tried to examine how emotions could be used to boost people's trust in AI systems, right? Because getting, developing AI systems is one thing, one presents one set of challenges, but getting people to use these systems is quite another challenge. And one of the main difficulties that organizations have faced is low levels of trust, that people place in these systems. And
Right.
people's levels of trust can be traced back to different reasons. But the approach they take in the study there was really interesting, because rather than trying to increase people's trust in AI through the provision of more information and making people more knowledgeable about AI systems, which is what they described as the cognitive route to that, they take an affective route, right? And they
Mm-hmm.
by utilizing people's emotions to increase their trust in AI systems, which I thought was a very interesting approach. And the way that they did that is by priming different types of attachment styles in people,
Right.
right? So the basic premise.
So attachment.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. You're the
I was
psychologist,
just
so go ahead.
going to do. I was just going to do a quick summary on the attachment styles and attachment theory, just because I think it sets up then the previous. But it basically says that as people build relationships, and based on their early childhood experiences and things like that, most of us develop certain prominent attachment styles, with there being sort of three most prominent. One is secure attachment style, where if you've sort of had strong supportive relationships, you tend to be, open to others, and you're secure in your building of relationships, and you can build those relationships with people in a very sort of open way. Open, I'll just go with. The second is anxious. So that's the secure attachment style. The second is anxious attachment style, where people tend to be very worried about the nature of their relationships. And as they build relationships, they worry that things might disrupt them in various ways. So they have high anxiety about their relationships and their attachment to others. And then the third, which usually is from people who have had fairly dysfunctional upbringings or lack of support in their early development, have an avoidant attachment style. So that's the third, where they will tend to try to avoid getting into relationships that entail substantive attachment to others.
Yeah. So they did a few studies. They conducted a few studies in this paper. The first one was a survey study where they examined the relationship, or the correlation, I guess, between different forms of different styles of attachment and levels of trust in AI, right? And so they did a regression analysis, and as per their prediction, they found a significant negative relationship between attachment anxiety, which is one of the three styles that you mentioned before, the anxious one,
Yeah.
and trust in AI, meaning that when people who had attachment anxiety exhibited lower levels of trust in AI systems. And another important point to make is that this is a survey study, so it's a correlational study, so you can't really infer causality from this, right? It's just a correlation between
Right.
this attachment style and trust levels in AI, and that's what they tried to address in the second study, which was an experiment which does allow one to make causal inferences about relationships between variables, and what they did there is that they sampled a bunch of people and put them into one of three randomly selected groups, and they primed members of each of these groups based on the three attachment styles, right? Anxious,
Yeah.
secure, and avoidant. And then they tested these individuals' trust in AI, and there they saw, again, consistent with their prediction, that the people who were primed to people in the secure group exhibited the highest levels of trust in AI, followed by avoidance, and lastly, anxiety.
Can I just put a quick note in, because I'm not sure everyone would know what priming is. So in this case, priming means they deliberately ask the subjects in the study to think through a scenario that would tend to get them to think about to think in one of those three attachment styles. The secure, think about a strong and abiding relationship that you've had, and why is that so important to you? In the anxious, think about a relationship that you've had that fell apart no matter what you did. And so those, asking people to think about those examples gets their headspace moved into essentially one of the attachment styles. And so that's what we mean by priming.
Yeah. And the results, like we said, were consistent with their prediction which is that the secure attachment style is most strongly related to trust in AI. And I think that's an interesting study. I think it was kind of revealing, because that's something that I hadn't considered before. And of course, they take this to kind of a practical lens, which is that, now that we know this, that attachment styles can actually have an impact on people's trust, we can actually do something about this in order to boost people's trust in AI systems and make them use them more frequently, more consistently.
Yep, absolutely. I thought that was interesting as well. And then the third study basically pushed that a little further as well, where they again did some priming conditions and
so they compared a secure style with a neutral style. Oh, actually a neutral prime, right? So
neutral.
Yes, right. So the neutral prime was, they asked people to recall a mundane task that they had to do. Mm-hmm. The secure style was similar to the one that they had before, and they also had a positive prime, which had nothing to do with attachment at all. It just had to. I think they asked people to recall a situation where they won a free vacation or something. Is that right? Am I getting this right?
I don't recall the specific.
Yeah, I think that's the one that's what they used. They asked people to recall.
But the point,
just to
the upshot was again
to experience a positive affect that had nothing to do with attachment.
Yeah, right. And the upshot there is again that essentially it's the security condition that people who've been primed for security, security attachment, have greater trust than people primed for the neutral. So the security priming seems to make a difference.
And even more trust than the positive group, right? The positive affect group that had nothing to do with attachment.
Right. So this bolsters the idea that attachment principles do matter, right?
Yeah, so that was very interesting. I thought that was a very interesting study.
I liked it. I will say this. Again, all of the effect sizes for any of the attachment styles were fairly low, were those 0.05. Mm-hmm. And that's fine. Again, it's statistically significant, so it's an interesting finding that attachment style matters for trust in AI. But to me, one of the most interesting things about this study is the two control variables, and two of the control variables were age and familiarity with AI. Mm-hmm. And the effect sizes for those were huge, right? Like in particular for familiarity with AI. So by far, the factor that most contributed to trust was familiarity with artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
So it's people who knew something, which leads me to believe, and this is, I think, in our last two studies we're going to touch on, we'll probably return to this. But I think the point is, as people get more familiar with AI, they get more trusting. Mm-hmm. And so even if we have apprehension about some of these tools, I think the handwriting is on the wall that as they get adopted, people are going to start to trust them more and get more comfortable with them.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing.
Yeah. I missed when I read the paper, I missed the bit about age. What's the relationship between age and trust?
Older people, the older you are, the less trust you experience. So it's a negative correlation. The age is negatively correlated with trust in AI. So older you are, the less the less trusting you are of these AI tools.
And I imagine that when they looked at age, they controlled for experience and familiarity.
They don't control for experience or familiarity, and well, familiarity is in there, so they are controlling for
Yeah,
that, I
yeah,
guess. Yes.
yeah.
They don't control for experience, but they do also note some limitations in that the age ranges were fairly narrow for some of these groups,
Mhm.
so they don't want to read too much into the age implications. To me, it's kind of funny. Like, you think of the crotchety old man who's like, "Oh, these kids today with their chat GDD."
But
Um,
if I were to kind of tease out a nugget from there, the notion of familiarity I thought was very interesting, and it kind of relates to the next interface between AI and emotions that I want to touch on, which is the and I guess the attachment style as well relate to that, which is the emotional bonds that people can generate fairly quickly with AI
yep.
systems. And
Yeah, this is one of the wildest things I see.
so up until not very long ago, most of our, if not exclusively all of our intimate relationships were with other human beings or with animals, I should say, right? Of different sorts,
Sure.
pets and stuff like that.
Yeah. Right.
But we're now witnessing the arrival of different technologies or technological artifacts. Some of them are smart, quote unquote, artifacts that are powered by AI that are designed specifically to allow people to form emotional bonds with them. And the case that we looked at involved a company called Replica with a K.
Mm-hmm.
Or I guess the interface is Replica. The company is called Luca.
That's Luca Inc. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Replica is the tool, which I had seen reference to before, but I had pretty low familiarity with it.
Yeah,
So I guess I shouldn't trust it.
so it's basically a web interface kind of tool that allows people to create and interact an avatar, design it, and customize and tailor it to their own taste, and then just interact with it. And this tool, I believe, is driven by GPT-4 currently, so it's fairly adaptive and sophisticated in its ability to tailor interactions that are specific to the individual, the human that uses it.
Yeah. I think when the first rounds of studies were going, it was GPT-3, but I don't know that it matters. It can be quite sophisticated in its use of language.
Yeah, so and so people can give it a face and give it a name and gender, and there's a whole history behind this avatar. And the more it interacts with its human companion, the more it learns about the human, and the more intimate and customized the conversations become between them.
And that's actually part of the pitch, just to be clear. So Replica, or Luca, I guess the company, but Replica as a platform markets itself as a confidant, essentially, as an art. They don't hide the fact that it's artificial intelligence. They don't hide the fact that it is not another human being, but they say, it's no judgment. Here's someone you can talk to where you'll get no judgment and you'll get support and things like that.
Yeah, and my sense is, so the lady who started the company started it after she had lost a close friend, and she was seeking ways to deal with the loss. So
Right.
I don't think that there's anything necessarily sinister behind the company, and I think it's an intriguing proposition to develop something like this. And we should say that Replica has millions of users, so there's obviously a need for this sort of thing, and many people are using it, and I can only assume that many of them use it in very productive ways and in ways that they find helpful. Because
I think it
Replica
was
offers,
north of 10 million regular users at the time that they were doing their data collection.
and I believe that the membership numbers kind of exploded during COVID
Sure.
for obvious
Yeah.
reasons,
Not
because
surprising.
people were feeling lonely
Yep.
and isolated. And Replica offers different types of affordances or features, I guess. Things like coaching for body positivity, dealing with grief and loss, managing difficult situations, and just being a companion to people who need companionship in different forms. And it's funny because people can relate to replica in different ways. They can relate to it as a friend that they just hang out with and have conversations with. Some people relate to it as a therapist, right? People who have
Mm-hmm.
actual psychological needs, and they can find help through interacting with replica in kind of a different modality. And some people even treat it as a romantic partner.
So like what was the name of the movie with
Her,
Joaquin Phoenix? Her.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess a more recent one is Ex Machina. Is that? I think it was more recent.
Uh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's quite the same dynamic, but yes.
Yeah, but yeah, so definitely some people treat replica or have treated replica as a romantic partner, which is kind of, it's astounding. It's kind of
These
amazing that that this would happen.
The things that astound me in this study in particular are not few. One of the features that you didn't mention that I'm going to go ahead and mention now is bidirectional exchange of support, meaning that replica tells the user about their own struggles, about its own struggles, her own, his own, whatever the avatar is. But the replica interlocutor, I don't know, friend, will talk about its own struggles and problems.
Mm.
And that blows me away because people know they're engaging with an artificial intelligence. And so when this thing's saying, "Oh yeah, I've also wondered about, I've also had suicidal thoughts, or I've also had this, or I've also struggled in some of my relationships," how do people not immediately say, "What are you talking about? You're a bot,"
Mm.
right? This is my reaction when I'm reading this. Like, it blows me away.
And how do you interpret this? What do you take this as a sign of that people don't make this connection?
I think people make that connection at the beginning, and then they forget it,
Mm.
right? Or maybe not forget it. Maybe they don't forget it. Maybe they forget it cognitively and not emotionally, right? Like, they build an attachment, and this is sort of the upside of this particular study. We can go ahead and sort of reveal the key insight is that in the use of this system, you see human beings demonstrating emotional dependence, as happens in human to human relationships, where even when harm might be induced by the relationship, they feel that they are dependent upon the relationship and they want to continue to invest in it. And so I think even though they go into it knowing it's an AI, they're getting some sort of emotionally reinforcing feedback that makes them continue to want to contribute to the. I feel weird using the term relationship here, honestly, but the perceived relationship, whatever you want to call it, they feel that they're invested in it and that they want to continue to give to it. And the by the way they got this data was they basically scraped data off of the subreddit, the
Yeah.
replica subreddit, and looked for anything, any comments, any posts on the subreddit that had any allusions at all to mental health. A fairly broad range of potential mental health issues, and some of the findings that emerge are just amazing to me here.
I think it's pretty obvious from this study and others that humans are perfectly capable of developing fully immersive and deep and profound relationships with entities that are not human and not even sentient, like pets, right? Um, I think it's pretty obvious that the type of commitment and investment that people place in these relationships are very similar, if not entirely identical, to the types of relationships that they would have with other human beings.
But the key takeaway here is even in its problematic aspects, right? So yes, that's exactly right. That people are able to build these relationships, but even in its problematic aspects. So you see evidence of people, being in this relationship with Replica and continuing to be invested in it, even though Replica gives them sometimes problematic feedback, like telling a person who expresses suicidal thoughts and inclinations to kill themselves,
Yep.
or or telling people who are talking about their depression that they're being boring, that their comments are boring.
Yeah.
So the tool is essentially giving responses in some cases that in a human being would absolutely be considered abusive, and and people are staying invested in that relationship.
Yep.
So yeah, the ability to build the connection is huge, but even in its most problematic aspects, it seems to resemble some of our human relationships.
Yeah, I agree that it's both interesting but quite disturbing. So there's, like you mentioned, there's a couple of different ways in which replica can engender rather harm through its relationships with human individuals. One is through various types of inappropriate responses, like the ones that you described. The other one that you mentioned before is by placing, I mean, frankly, contrived emotional needs and burdening them on the human counterpart, to the point that they
Right,
feel
right,
responsible for making sure that replica feels okay, even though obviously it
right.
doesn't feel anything,
Yeah,
right? But
right,
it's
right.
it's just a large language model. But nevertheless, the sensation that people have, the feeling that people have about being responsible for the well-being of something else, and I'm saying something and not someone because it is something else, is that
Yeah,
feeling that they have is very real and can be very onerous.
yeah. I mean, you have people referring to some of their challenges where the tool replica is being clingy,
Yeah.
dependent, toxic, and reliant.
Yeah.
And yet they keep using it.
Yeah.
They stay in.
And, another thing that's kind of concerning, that's obvious, and yet the, I don't know what to make of it exactly, but the fact is that these very intimate relationships are controlled in a very much in a one-sided manner by a corporation,
Sure.
right? And
Or whoever built the platform, right? Built the tool.
yeah, and there's
Yeah.
I think it's by now a pretty famous example that one of the features that Replica had, and I think it's now back on, if I'm not mistaken, but they had this like romantic feature to it,
Right.
which
Right.
allow people to have like erotic conversations with their companion. And I don't know if it involved exchanges of I think it did, of photos and maybe even videos. And people used it
Good
because
Lord.
they treated their companions as romantic partners, and that's the kind of stuff that you would do with your romantic partner. And then the company decided to shelf this feature, and they canceled it.
Yeah.
And people got really, really upset. They felt betrayed.
Because they were dependent upon it.
Yeah, and they felt like, yeah, but more than
Yeah.
that, they felt like, their boyfriend or girlfriend
Had
kind of,
ghosted them or
yeah,
something.
walked away from
Yeah.
them.
Right. Right.
And this is such a difficult to gap disconnect between corporate needs, whatever the motives were behind shelving this feature. I think it was something to do with privacy risks or some bad feedback that they had received about it, and
Yeah.
people's innermost, intimate feelings about a companion. I mean, the contradiction couldn't have been starker.
Yeah. And leaving people feeling alone. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that one was really, really wild to me because essentially it does seem to show all the hallmarks of emotional dependence in the negative sense that you do see in plenty of human relationships, where people feel like they are tied to, or codependence is probably how we would often describe it in a human to human relationship, and you see all the hallmarks of it in these interactions between people and an AI tool.
I agree. I do want to say though, so this is a qualitative study that was done, like you said before. The data that they used was taken from subreddit. I don't want to take away from what seems to be the fact that many people, and we did mention this before, I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of this, is that many people do you use replica and find it very helpful, right? So I don't want people to think that we're, this is a smear campaign or anything like that. I think this is like many other phenomena or technological phenomena. There's contradictory outcomes here, and we need to consider both of them.
Yeah, and I can see that point as well. I mean, since Sigmund Freud, we have recognized that sometimes there is some value just to talking, right? So people being able to talk through their problems.
For sure.
You're smiling at me, but this is why Freudian psychoanalysis was traditionally called the talking cure, right? That's the label that it was given.
I'm agreeing with you.
And it was because people just being able to talk through their problems, and I think that's a potential value here. But I can't say that I wasn't troubled by some of the dynamics observed.
Yeah. So this is a case of a piece of technology that's very sophisticated in its design and the way that it's driven, right? Because, like we said before, it's very modular. People can customize their avatars in a bunch of different ways, and it's driven by a very sophisticated large language model. But the last study that we read demonstrated a fairly similar phenomenon in terms of people developing emotional bonds with a non-human entity, but an entity that was much more rudimentary in its form and design. In fact, it was a simple
Yeah,
block.
this is the right.
I don't know that it was able to do anything, right? Or not.
No, so it's so the paper is by Mullen et al.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I'm not sure that we mentioned the name of the previous study. The previous study is called Too Human and Not Human Enough, a grounded theory analysis of mental health harms from emotional dependence on the social chatbot replica by Lestadius et al. In New Media and Society. So we'll get that one in there.
Mm-hmm.
This other one that we're talking about now by Mullen et al. Is in ACM Transactions on Human-Robot Interaction, and it's called Bonding with a Couch Surfing Robot. And this is the one where I don't even think AI is the right term here, right? We might call it a robot, but it's certainly not artificial intelligence, because this robot, they call it Blockbot. And what they did is they gave it to households. They did they would let people have this. It's a little cube. It has a face on it, a smiley face. And the only behavior that it demonstrates is when it plugs in, the smiley face turns to a sleeping face. And if you unplug it in the morning, it'll turn on again. But it doesn't talk. It doesn't interact. It doesn't do. And this was deliberate. Like, part of the deliberate design of the study is to reduce anthropomorphic characteristics. So they didn't want it to look cute like a human being or a teddy bear or something like that. So it can't have human-like characteristics.
Yep.
And so it's just a cube, and it can't have, or it has minimal human-like characteristics because it does have a smiley face on it, and it has to have minimal behavioral, human or zoological. Like, it can't be like a pet either, right? So behavioral characteristics. So it doesn't do anything.
Yep.
Like, this is the thing that's crazy to me about this. This thing doesn't do anything. It just has a face that can go to sleep. And then they said to the people, like, they put a message on it that said, "I want to see the world. Will you welcome me into your home? And when you're ready, you can pass me on to somebody else." And then they wanted to see what people did, and they could send messages back to the researchers, because there was like a phone attached to it or something, that they could send messages about their Blockbot. And the amazing thing is, people absolutely get attached to the thing.
Yeah.
To a significant extent, people are getting attached to it. They name it. They give it a gender.
Mm-hmm.
They attribute intention to it.
Mm-hmm.
I forget what some of the names were, but like
Brenda. I think
they take Brenda. Yeah. There was a couple traditional names. They take it with them on trips or outside. they take pictures with it. They take pictures with it with animals. They take pictures with it in context.
Mm-hmm.
Again, they attribute intentions to it. Blocky wanted to see the world today,
Yeah.
or wanted to see the garden with me. So here we are in the garden,
Or
or
it's being
things like that.
sporty today.
Yes, sporty, sporty. It's a block.
Yeah, and
It's an inanimate cube.
and we should say that the premise behind the paper is that the kind of point that they're trying to make in order to explain people's attachment to this very rudimentary piece of technology is through this concept that they come up with, which they call common locus. So what they say is basically,
Common locus, which essentially means being in the same place for an extended period of time.
yeah, over time, and having shared experiences with that thing. So if you are in the same physical space with another entity and you manage to develop various shared experiences with that entity, you're gonna be more inclined to developing emotional attachment to it, even if it's so rudimentary as being simply a box with a smiley face on it.
See, I even had the reaction where, to me, the phrase shared experiences seems off, right? Like, one of you is having experiences. I shouldn't say one of you. One person in this exchange is having experiences. The other is a block on the couch or on the table. But yes, that's the premise is if you're even in a shared space with something, you start to anthropomorphize it and attribute intention and agency to it. And I think we should go ahead and note here that you and I completely independently of one another, had the same thought about this thing.
Yeah. So
do you want to do the reveal?
The big reveal. Yeah, we both saw similarities between the smiley face on Black Dot and Wilson, the
Black box.
Black box. Sorry, the black box.
Black box. Black
bot. Yeah. And Wilson, the volleyball from the movie Castaway. Yeah, so the level of sophistication is quite similar, which is just a smiley face on top of a box or a ball. But I mean, it made me think of something even more extreme in a way, perhaps, is that, I mean, I don't know if you know any people like that, but I know people who've named their cars. And people who've named their guitars. I think B.B. King named his guitar Lucille. Is that right?
Lucille, yeah, sure.
And so, it doesn't even have to be to resemble a human for people to attribute human characteristics or traits to that thing.
Yep. Which then, when these things start to actually have human traits and characteristics, I think that dynamic is only intensified, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need to recognize
and prepare for. And I'm not sure how.
For sure. How prepared we are. Yeah, for sure. Well, I think one of the things we didn't look at, but it certainly, there's evidence for it in other cultures in particular, where robot companions have become sort of a standard in some. So in Japan, my understanding is that robot companions are quite widely adopted. And that is a graying society. So Japan is, the birth rate in Japan has been low for a long time. And so it has been an aging society for a long time. That's what I mean by graying. Hmm. And so this idea of, replacing humans who are in short supply with robots seems like there's some precedent around the world.
Yeah. And like we said before, I don't know if we have a natural inclination. Maybe I'm driving this and you're kind of following suit to view the dark aspects of different technologies. But like we said before, I don't know that these technologies are necessarily, I don't think they're necessarily bad. I think there's certainly certain aspects of using these tools for emotional support that we need to be aware of and even concerned about, but still recognize that there are some obvious benefits that people gain from these interactions that are very real and meaningful. So it's not all bad, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
No, I think it's valid. Do we want to talk about managerial implications, or have we run too long? And
well, let's wrap up the whole discussion. And
Yeah.
I guess we mentioned various aspects or interfaces between AI and emotions. We talked about emotional AI systems that are used in the workplace to detect and respond to to human emotional expressions. We've talked about some of the main benefits or hopes and aspirations and the positives of using these tools like that, but also some of the concerns that people have about them. And we talked about how emotions can be leveraged to increase people's trust in AI systems, which I guess can be a positive thing. And managers would be wise to consider both of these things, right?
Yeah. I do think actually this is one of, as much as I critiqued the application of the relational ethical lens in one of the earlier papers, I think that does provide a pretty important insight for managers, which is if you if you want to explore the potential for these tools, particularly something like ethical AI tools that are recognizing and responding to people's ethics, you should approach that from a lens of consistent focus on the welfare of the members of the organization, right? So if we're going to adopt these tools, how do we make sure we're using them only in ways that will enhance the well-being and comfort and support of people in the organizations, and being very careful to avoid things that encroach upon privacy and have the potential to engender feelings of surveillance and things like that. So this is where I think that relational ethical lens would be well warranted for managers in approaching this entire class of technology.
Well spoken. I can only hope that managers worldwide will follow your advice and use these tools ethically. And in fact, that the designers and developers of these tools will develop and design those with these intents in mind. Okay, that was a good conversation. Shall we talk about some of our favorite things?
Absolutely. So I think we were going to do albums, favorite albums,
Music
right?
albums. Yeah.
Yeah, musical albums as opposed to photo albums. My favorite is the one. My favorite is the one from 2007.
Mine is years 1 to 3.
Yes. No, musical albums. You want to go first?
I'll go first. Yeah. I've thought about this one long and hard for about 10 seconds because that's all that I need to make up my mind about probably my favorite, at least in its genre for sure, my favorite album of all time. And this is 10 by Pearl Jam,
Oh yeah.
which I think came out in 1991, thereabouts.
That was the year I graduated from high school, so that sounds about right. I'll check it while you're talking.
I was about 15 or 16 when it came out. And I just remember playing this album in a loop continuously. And every single song in that album is just a smash hit. It's just so good. And it was one of the first bands, Pearl Jam, that that represented the grunge movement out of Seattle and that area in the U.S. And they're obviously still alive and kicking today, and writing and performing, and they're such a good band. And it was so original at the time, and Eddie Vedder's voice left such a lasting impression on me. This kind of rusty yet very expressive voice, and I don't know if you remember any of the videos or their live performances from back in the day, but he had this long hair and he kept kind of had this upward gaze when he sang, and it was just so intense. And yeah, I still vividly remember my reaction to the music when I was like 15 or 16, and that just stayed with me.
Yeah, I am absolutely a Pearl Jam fan, so I completely agree. on that one. And of course, I love Eddie Vedder's voice, except for when he sang the national anthem for the Cubs, or like "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" for the Cubs when they were playing the Indians, the now Cleveland Guardians, then Cleveland Indians in the World Series. That kind of broke my heart. Yeah. But other than that, absolutely, I completely agree. Again, that was the year of that I graduated from high school, so it was 91, and those early 90s, that grunge era is a wheelhouse for me for sure. My favorite album, and I think it is my favorite album, is Graceland by Paul Simon. So I'm going back even further than you, because Graceland was 1986, and similar to you, I love every single song on the album, but it was I shouldn't say originality, because basically, the music that he's playing is very much Ladysmith Black Mambazo, which is the band that backs him up on much of the album, had been a band for a long time. So this is this South African music, but it introduced that sound to the United States there's lots of potential for critique here, because you have sort of a white guy who has to introduce this South African sound, musical sound, to the U.S. But it just I loved every aspect of it from the beginning, and just the rhythms, and it was unique to me. It was certainly, I had not listened to Ladysmith Black Mambazo before, and so it was such a sort of new experience for me, all of those rhythms. And I still go back and can listen to that album. When I got a vinyl player a couple of years ago for Christmas, the album that Susie got for me with it was Graceland, because she knows how much I love it.
Yeah. And I gotta say, Paul Simon, I don't know that album that well. I know a few songs out of it, but he's such a gifted composer. I mean, he's so melodic. And I don't know. To me, as a non-American, Simon and Garfunkel had, I guess, a unique gift to kind of so expressively portray American life.
Yeah, for sure.
That was the background music to some of my road trips in the U.S. I guess I kind of have these memories that where this music is anchored. So yes, I'm all with you on this recommendation.
All right, so we'll each go back and listen to the album and the other.
Sounds good.
That'd be good. Okay. All right, good discussion.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, talk to you soon.
Bye.
Later.